How will Red Bull's punishment hurt them? The 2022 cost cap breach is a mystery that has finally been solved, and it didn't end well for Red Bull. According to the official statement from the FIA, Red Bull will pay $7 million and lose 10% of the wind tunnel time, along with the CFD for the 2023 season, 12 months starting from now. This may seem like a small penalty for the Austrian team, but believe us when we say that it's far from a minor penalty. So how will this penalty affect Red Bull? Is it possible that they'll drop off a lot in performance? The 2021 season was one of the most controversial ones when it comes to the Drivers' Championship, and we saw Hamilton and Verstappen enter the last race with an equal amount of points. Nevertheless, it ended the way it did, and Mercedes were really angry about how Hamilton was stripped of his record-breaking 8th championship. But that is the reality, and that is something that will leave a permanent scar on both Hamilton and Mercedes. Now, on top of that, they have to accept the fact that Red Bull caused a breach that was around $2 million, and although it was for catering and sick pay, $2 million spent more than the allowed $145 million is something that they are considering a huge amount of money. The Brackley-based team has put a lot of pressure on the FIA to bring a penalty that will suit Red Bull, and it will indeed be a harsh one, although the championship that they have committed the breach in will remain as it was. Toto Wolff spoke publicly about the breach, saying that if Red Bull is given a financial penalty for breaching the cap, then from 2023 on, his team will intentionally breach the budget cap and pay whatever the fine will be just to bring themselves back to the top. Ferrari has also put a lot of pressure on the FIA, saying that they are truly doubting that Red Bull will be able to stay within the budget cap and spend the amount of money that is allowed, $140 million in the 2022 season. With all of this pressure on its shoulders, the FIA has brought daylight upon the fine, penalizing Red Bull with $7 million and a 10% deduction in wind tunnel time and CFD. You may think this penalty is a symbolic one or a slap on the wrist, but it's far from that. Red Bull are one team that hasn't struggled a lot with porpoising, not at all if we're being honest. However, that has been done by spending a lot of time in the CFD and wind tunnels, as they were able to understand the physics of it and build a floor that would create a downforce with the perfect amount of flexion to prevent the porpoising. That is something with which Ferrari and Mercedes have struggled, and although the rest of the season went well for them in those terms, starting from Silverstone onwards, it's still something that took a lot of points off their table. The 2023 season will see the implementation of a higher ride height, and although Red Bull won't likely suffer from porpoising given the fact that they weren't suffering with such a low-ride car, the fact remains that they'll have much less time to test it in the CFD and wind tunnel. What's even worse for them is the fact that they won the Constructors' Championship, meaning that they will have a reduced time in the wind tunnel because they have won the Constructors' Championship in 2022 after being P2 in 2021. According to F1, the team that has improved from the previous season in the Constructors' Championship will be given a bigger prize amount, but less time spent in the wind tunnels. This is something that has been emphasized by Christian Horner, who said that the penalty was a draconian one, adding that it was mostly brought up to them due to the pressure of Red Bull's rivals. When talking about this matter, Horner said, "I've heard people reporting today that it's an insignificant amount. I can tell you now, that is an enormous amount. That represents anywhere between a quarter and half a second's worth of lap time. That comes in from now. That has a direct effect on next year's car and will be in place for a 12-month period. By winning the Constructors' Championship, we become victims of our own success. In addition to that 10%, having 5% incremental disadvantage or handicap compared to the second and third place. That 10% put into reality will have an impact on our ability to perform on track next year." But Red Bull's rivals aren't buying the narrative that the Austrian team is the victim, and they surely aren't happy with the penalty that's been given to them. For example, Laurent Mekies, the sporting director of Ferrari, spoke about the penalty and the whole process, and although he praised the FIA for its transparency and for setting an example with Red Bull, he doesn't believe the penalty is a fair one for the breach they have committed. "We have talked a lot in recent weeks about what one can do with $500,000 more, or $1 million or $2 or $3. €2 million is a significant amount, and we have given our opinion several times on this topic. We at Ferrari think that this amount is worth around a couple of tenths per lap, and it's so easy to understand that these figures can have a real impact on the outcome of the races and maybe even a championship. As for the penalty, we are not happy with it for two important reasons. The first is that we at Ferrari do not understand how the 10% reduction of ATR can correspond to the same amount of lap time that we mentioned earlier. Furthermore, there is another problem in that, since there is no cost cap reduction in the penalty, the basic effect is to push the competitor to spend the money elsewhere. It has total freedom to use the money it can no longer spend on use of the wind tunnel and CFD due to the 10% reduction, on reducing the weight of the car, or who knows what else. The same attitude prevails in the other teams, such as Mercedes, who praised the FIA for the same reasons that Ferrari did, but aren't happy with how the penalty was given to the Austrian team. According to Wolff, the penalty is too little for them, but it is too big for Red Bull, pointing out that there are two viewing points out of this scenario. I think as for any penalty, for us it's too little. I think any reduction in wind tunnel time is going to be detrimental. How detrimental is difficult to judge at this stage. I think in absolute terms, $7 million is a lot of money, but in the bigger scheme of things for Red Bull, considering the investment they do on the power unit side and on the team, it's not. The remainder of the grid wasn't happy either. Principals like Steiner, Capito and Seidel were truly pushing for the right penalty to be given to the Austrian team, mostly because they aren't really the richest of the teams on the grid, and they can't spend as much money as they would like to. Some of the teams have around half the allowed budget, making their conditions to compete on the grid even harsher. On top of that, they have to accept the fact that one team spent $2 million on something that they are cutting staff to achieve the optimum spending budget. Andreas Seidel, McLaren's principal, was really angry with how the whole situation went down, and he was asked whether or not he heard the press conference of Red Bull after the Mexican GP practice sessions. To this, he replied that he has no intent of hearing fairy tales about how the team is the victim and how they are being bullied by other teams. In terms of the penalty being harsh or right where it's supposed to be, Seidel said, "No, I didn't listen to that Horner's presentation, because I can imagine it was another fairy tale, probably. I'm not really interested in that. On a positive side, I think it's good to see that the FIA did a good job in terms of doing the audit. 9 teams got it right, and it was clear one team was in breach, so that's a positive outcome. But on a negative side, it's also clear from my point of view that the penalty doesn't fit the breach. I just hope moving forward we have stricter penalties in place." With that being said, it's obvious that the penalty will hurt Red Bull in the future, but was it enough to set a proper example of what will happen to the teams if they commit a breach in the budget cap? Obviously, it sets some kind of standard, but is it going to be a deterrent as to whether or not the teams will choose to breach the budget cap? It's up to us to wait and find out.